Today I will be talking about the convict labor on the Asheville and Spartanburg Railroad, better known as the Saluda Grade, as we kind of know it here in Saluda. I will say this is going to be a very heavy talk. We're going to talk about some very graphic and disturbing issues. So if you find this to be too much to handle, please take the space you need. Please leave if you need to. But I would encourage all of you to stay and listen. This is a very serious story, and it's an important story that we remember because for the past 150 years, much of this story has been forgotten. And it is only until I started getting nosy and asking a few too many questions that I really started to discover what exactly has happened here in Saluda and the foundation of the community that we all love and enjoy today. So convict labor is an unjust system in which people who are incarcerated are forced to work against their will. And convict leasing was a very common practice in the Reconstruction era United States. And that is what built the railroad that extends from Spartanburg through Saluda, Hendersonville, and into Asheville Junction from the south. It was also used widely across western North Carolina. So today we will be talking about that. Just to talk about the trajectory of this project, this was at the start just a term paper. I just wanted to take a history elective, and I was like, well, I've done pretty much all of the East Asian history classes they offer. I really do like Reconstruction era history, and if you know anything about what my parents do with preserving a picturesque America, you know why I have a soft spot for Reconstruction era history. So I took that class with Dr. Angela Zimmerman, who I look up to immensely. And so I took her class, and at the end of the term, I had to do a term paper. So I thought, well, I just moved to Saluda from Asheville with my family. This would be a great way to get to know the community that I just moved into by really deep diving into some history. And so I came here into this museum for some inspiration. And this placard you see behind you called Hardships and Heartbreaks was the inspiration for this project. I saw this and I had a lot more questions. And I had a whole list of questions, and my paper ended up being pretty much only questions and not really a lot of answers. Just for this, because I was just home for spring break, checked this out, took a couple photos, and then went back to DC. But my professor encouraged me to keep digging deeper. And so I spent the summer after that spring term, got home to Saluda, spent that summer doing a lot of research, having oral history interviews with some of the people in this room too, and doing a lot of research in museums and different archives to see if I could really get to the bottom of some of the questions that I had come up with. And this ended up becoming my independent history thesis for my minor once I was pursuing that at George Washington. And I got an A on that paper. So that went well, but then I got busy with the rest of getting ready for graduation, trying to find a job. But I do want to continue to pursue this research, and this talk has motivated me to continue that a great deal. I have appointments at the State Archives in Raleigh, and I'm hoping to also explore judicial records in counties in eastern North Carolina as well to further this research. So this is a work in progress. This is what I have so far. And you might have a lot of questions after this talk that I'm still asking and I'm still looking for the answers to. So this will continue to be a project that we need to research. I do have a writer's residency coming up in December out in Knoxville, Tennessee, that I will be doing for a week to really get some pre-publishing edits done, and I'm hoping to publish a book, a first edition of a book, in 2026. Yeah. So that way you can really deep dive into all of the details. I would also like to review and revisit this placard back here and make some revisions. This is a very general, brief overview of what this carceral system looked like, but it's not very specific to what happened right here in Saluda. A lot of this piece here is based off of what was on the Western North Carolina Railroad, which has been better researched and better funded. But no one's really talking about what happened right here on the Saluda Grade and the foundation of essentially what would become Saluda. And then also finally, looking ahead to the Rails to Trail project, where this railway is going to be turned into a trail, we can also hopefully look forward to seeing some more historical placards to contextualize this history along the rails to trails. So before we really dive deep into it, I just wanted to frame some things with some guiding research questions and also some questions we should just be asking ourselves as a community. First, why is it that we know so little about these convicts? There's a lot of really well-documented history in Polk County, and for some reason, this was always skipped over. In almost every document I looked at, any 20th century scholarship, it was one sentence, and that was the only mention of the convicts. It's just that they existed. The convicts built the Saluda Grade. No details, no explanation of why, how, anything. And so we can ask ourselves a lot of those next questions. Why was convict labor used and not free labor, where people were paid for their work and they volunteered and elected to do this work? What were these conditions like? Who were these people other than just what we can see on paper? Did they have families? What ended them up in the carceral system? What happened to them afterwards? There's so many questions we can ask about these people's humanity as well. And also, who is the person telling this story? And is it even mine to tell? I mean, I'm a white woman telling this story, and this is the story of mostly black men. And so it's important that we ask who tells this story and explore that as deeper as well. And it's also easy to feel like this is a really, really long, distant past, but it's really not that long ago. It's only 150 years ago, and we just lost Priscilla Pearson, who was a descendant of Captain Pearson, who was very influential here. And she, in her lifetime, talked about meeting an enslaved person, a formerly enslaved person, Phoebe Cheek Sullivan, whom, if you're a history person in Saluda, you know. And so this really we aren't that far removed. We just lost someone who in their lifetime knew someone who was a slave. So this is really not that long ago. And so there are real ramifications for our community in these atrocities in the 21st century. And as we start to remember this more vividly, we have more clarity, things like that, how do we ensure that this legacy is not forgotten? And how do we ensure that this is an integral part of the story of Saluda? Even though it's an uncomfortable truth, how do we remember it and carry it forward and honor these people? So, just some historical context. We'll start really big and narrow all the way down to Saluda. This is the end of the Civil War, Reconstruction era. We see the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th is the most crucial for this. We see the abolition of slavery, except there's an exception clause, as punishment for a crime. And that becomes the crux of how this system is created in North Carolina. We see a very drastically changed America. There's social change going on. There's a lot of domestic migration occurring as well. We see a lot of black communities picking up from their homes in the South and headed north. So we see the first waves of the Great Migration. We also see a totally changed labor market. Because the South had been accustomed to slavery the entirety of its existence, when all of a sudden there's no longer a free labor source to exploit, it becomes really messy really quickly, because now people can pay a black person less than they can pay a white person to do the same job. And so now white people that have been working jobs are no longer able to get a job or something like that. So the labor market's totally disrupted, and everyone is getting underpaid. So in North Carolina specifically, we're looking at mass destruction after the war. The railroad system's messed up. The state facilities are messed up. The entire, there's plantations that have been burned to the ground. There's economic devastation everywhere. And the state is really grappling with a very difficult budget problem. And so North Carolina is really hoping to expand westward. And into what is, in western North Carolina, they're referring to that as kind of the frontier of the state. This is where they have mineral resources, timber resources that really haven't been tapped into. There hasn't been extensive mining. There hasn't been extensive logging. All of this area at that time was just virgin forest, except for little patches that had been cleared for farms and things like that. It was all enormous, enormous trees. And so in this economic desperation, the state is really looking to expand westward. And Governor Zebulon Vance really capitalized on that desperation. He campaigned as kind of a champion of western North Carolina. He was born in Buncombe County. And he, was kind of, that's how he was able to really secure the gubernatorial election for himself, is saying, we're going to bring progress to the West. And so a lot of other private enterprise was also very interested in this as a way to make their fortune and get started that way. So this progress to the West narrative is very prominent. If you read any of the newspapers of the time, if you read a lot of 20th century scholarship, that's going to be the narrative that you hear. But I ask that you question that narrative of progress, because we need to think about progress as to benefit who? Because there's many people that have a lot to gain, but there's also people who have a great deal to lose with this so-called progress. Is this progress for the state? Yes. Is this progress for those people who are entrepreneurs and are trying to extract timber and mineral resources from the West? Yes. But what about the indigenous people that were dispossessed of their land? And once it's clear-cut, will never be able to go back to their traditional ways. It's not really progress for the Black community of North Carolina, who is now being forced to work on the railroads and has no land, no resources. And it's not even real progress for the poor white settlers that are already living in the mountains, because they were tricked and deceived into selling their mineral rights or their timber rights and received very little money. Their land would be stripped of all of its value, and then would be left with little to nothing. And still they would be poor as they were when this all started. So who is this progress for, really? So here in Saluda, there is no Saluda. The Saluda does not come up until the railroad is here. And so at this time, this is just Pace's Gap. And most of eastern Polk County and Henderson, this part of Henderson, the border of western Henderson County as well, is largely undeveloped. There's hardly anybody here, except for a few white settler families. Famously, the Paces, that Pace's Gap is named after, who I'm sure there are a couple Paces in the room with us as well. But other than those people, it was very sparsely populated here. And so this was really going to bring a lot of the people into the mountains as well. So the state wants to expand to the west, and their first goal is to connect Spartanburg, a big important railroad hub, to Asheville, the major city in western North Carolina. And this is not just about connecting those two cities and getting more commerce in those two cities and accessing the resources between those two cities, but it is also about providing another route north. This is going to be a great way for resources and people to transport back and forth between maybe Atlanta or Charleston and then up to Cincinnati or Chicago, which are big industrial hubs of the time. So this is a really big move to make transit more accessible, transit of goods and transit of people. There's a long, extensive history that I could get into and would be 3 chapters in a book and another 2 hours of talking about the men in power at the time, both governments and businessmen who were involved in this. It's pretty boring, and they made a lot of mistakes, and we only really need to focus on 3 major decisions that they made. We don't need to focus on their story, because today we're focusing on the story of the convicts. So ultimately, there's three major decisions: the route selection, labor sourcing, and in the enforcement of that labor. The route selection is very important because it's why Saluda exists. Initially, they were going to go from Tryon to Columbus and then take the route up what is now I-26. And that was going to be more expensive, and that was going to be a lot more complicated engineering-wise in terms of like soil stability and things like that. So instead, they went from Tryon to Melrose, following the Pacolet River, and up to what is right here, Saluda. So because of that, they ended up going through a lot less densely populated area, and the work was really intense because it is the steepest grade, as we all know. The labor sourcing, of course, is hugely influential. This is the reason we have this presentation at all, is that initially they were using free labor, but they realized they were going to go broke doing that. And so instead, they switched over to using carceral labor. And we will get a lot into the details with that soon. Finally, the enforcement of labor is the final decision. This is not necessarily being enforced directly by the governments and businessmen, but they would hire white overseers who would be there armed with guns and would inflict violence via whippings, beatings, and shootings in order to ensure that this work was being done and done in what they deemed an appropriate and efficient manner. So this is particularly important because the Spartanburg and Asheville Railroad, Captain Pearson, who is the kind of chief engineer of this project, he has a cousin in the state legislature. And he's like, we're not going to get this project done. We're going to go broke. This is going to be really bad, and I'm going to be out of a job. So he calls up his cousin. He doesn't call him. He telegrams him. But he says, okay, I need you to work on something in the state legislature to fix this. And this is how we get the convict leasing system in North Carolina, is because of that very conversation, where we did not have convict leasing in North Carolina. Other states have had it. Louisiana had it before the Civil War even. But North Carolina has been eyeing it as a potential way to rebuild in these times of like economic stability and everything else. And so they say, all right, we're really desperate in this project. Let's model this, what other states have done, and we're going to implement the convict leasing system. So pre-Civil War, the economics of the South are entirely built on slave labor. That's the expectation, that black people are supposed to work for free. And that is the foundation of the economic system of the South. And so when that is changed, there is widespread economic instability, and it changes the labor market entirely. In this project, they are able to get to the state line using free labor, but that's the really easy part. This is before you actually get into the mountains. If you go from Spartanburg to Campobello to Inman to Landrum, all of that's hilly, but not the mountains. Once they get to Tryon, they stop. And so that is when convict labor comes into play. So the narratives of the Democrats in the North Carolina state legislature and on the national scale generally, and their media allies, mostly in newspapers, they are pushing a certain narrative around black people. During the Civil War and before the Civil War, that was all about black people are submissive. Black people like to work. It's good for black people to work like this. That is the narrative that helps give legitimacy to chattel slavery. Now that doesn't really work in these times when now there's convict labor. And so instead, they shift the narrative to give validity to a new system of forced labor. And that is that black people are inherently criminal. It's in their nature to be criminal. And so then they start disseminating this information in their political rhetoric and in newspaper editorials and things of that nature. And so that's how we see this stereotype, essentially, a constructed stereotype, give legitimacy to a change in the way that black people are forced to work for free. So the state is dealing with two problems. They want to expand west. They don't have the resources to do that. They really need to do it because they're strapped for cash, but they don't have the cash to make that happen. So they're also dealing with the fact that they're pushing this narrative of black people are criminal, and so black people are now being arrested en masse. Before the Civil War, the black population in prisons was 0. It was only white people in prison, and maybe some indigenous people, but only white people were in prisons because black people were not regarded as people. Now, black people have recognition as citizens, that means they also can be charged with crimes. And so they are being charged with crimes like stealing an apple, okay? 5 years hard labor, that's your sentencing. And so now you're in the penitentiary, but they don't have enough room for all the people that they're arresting. And so they do two things. One, they start forcing the people that are incarcerated to build a larger prison. So they're literally being forced to build their own prison. And so they're able to say, oh, well, all we have to pay for is the material costs. We don't have any labor costs. So that's great. So we're building an asset for the state, and we're getting it done for cheaper. Now, they still don't want to have to pay, because when someone's in prison, you've got to pay for their food, you've got to pay for their clothes, you've got to pay for their housing, you've got to pay for the guards. All that's very expensive. And so instead, they say, well, what if we just lease these people out to plantations, to private enterprises? And so then that person's in charge of feeding them, clothing them, housing them. And so once that's done, they have shifted those costs away from the state. And then, on top of that, that private enterprise, that plantation, that railroad, whatever, is going to pay the state a certain amount per day for that person's labor. And so, in that sense, this becomes very profitable for the state, actually. So the more people they arrest, the more people they put in the carceral system, the more money they can just be raking in. At one point, this was 85% of Louisiana's tax revenue. It was insanely profitable. It was never to that scale in North Carolina, but in other states, this was almost the exclusive source of state revenue. So this is great for the economic development of the state. Democrats really, really like this, and so they push this through. But it is important to note that this is deeply racialized, and this is done specifically so that they can essentially reinvent slavery to augment black people into working for free, once again. So they have this system in place. They ship people from the penitentiary in a boxcar crammed full of people out to Tryon to start work up the Saluda Grade and on their way to Asheville. The working conditions are nothing short of horrific. There's very demanding work. They must first cut a flat that's wide enough for the train. They also have to blast rock out of their way, or blast rock to fill in the low points in the path. They also have to lay the railroad ballast. They have to fell timber for the railroad ties. They're laying rail, and they're driving steel. And all of this is done with very, very few resources. They do have some oxen in some records. From one photo, we can see that they have wheelbarrows, presumably to move rocks back and forth. We do see the use of early gunpowder blasting mixed with like corn mash and gunpowder. But this was very unpredictable, very unstable, so we can imagine that there's a lot of like stone shrapnel going into these convicts' bodies. It's very cruel. And we also see things like axes and hammers, but because of how poorly funded this project is, they may not have even had sufficient tools. And we do have records on similar projects under similar economic stresses where people are just using something as crude as a flat rock or their bare hands to do this work. And so you can only imagine how much their hands were bleeding, how much their hands had been bleeding for months, and they still had to continue doing the work. This is from the Western North Carolina Railroad. I believe somewhere in Henderson County there may have been a bunkhouse. This is kind of unsure on the Asheville and Spartanburg Railroad. But a bunkhouse would have been made from timber in the area. It would have been constructed for the express purpose of keeping the convicts confined at night. And so this was a kind of sorry excuse for shelter. It was not well ventilated. There's no windows, nothing like that. And the tons of people are going to be crammed in here, and they will be locked there for the whole night. They can't go out to the bathroom, so you can imagine the feces and urine that they're having to sleep in. And of course, they're all crammed in this space, and so disease will also be rampant in these bunkhouses. We also see forms of mobile confinement, modified rail cars that can be kind of pushed along as the rails are built so that they're closer and closer to where they're making progress. And also kind of mobile, like carriage-like cages that they would have been kept in. So really, really cruel conditions. We also see that the state provided the clothes. They were the classic striped convict clothes. They were far too thin for wintertime especially, so you can only imagine how brutally cold it got, how much frostbite they may have had. Medical care was poor at best. Absent I have no real records of any medical care being given. And so it may have been them caring for each other when people were injured. And many people, of course, succumbed to their injuries. And then we see very, very meager rations. People are only allotted 16 cents per day by the railroad company in order to provide all the food that they need for the day. So that is usually going to be some cornmeal, some peas, some potatoes, and on Sunday they were afforded a little bit of pork. And that was all they had to survive on for months, years, and the entirety of their sentence. We do know that when these convicts were working, they sang, because in their songs, they could coordinate their timing with each other. So if everyone is singing the same song, they know to swing the axe at the same time, to drive those railroad spikes at the right time, where they're not going to injure each other. And so we do have some songs. I'm going to try and play one at the end of the presentation from the Western North Carolina Railroad, but we do not have any of the songs from here on the Asheville and Spartanburg Railroad. Only the forest really remembers those songs. So there's a lot of death, as you might imagine. In 1876 and 77, we have 43 recorded deaths. All of these men and boys are black except for one, and there was one white man who died as well. 5 of these deaths are children. They are as young as 14 years old. The 14-year-old was Scott Nicholson. So there are not even adults, and they're being taken from their families, charged with these crimes, forced to work until they died. There are a total of 63 that I have been able to track down that died on the Asheville and Spartanburg Railroad, out of a workforce of approximately 300 convicts that did this project, which balances out to about 1 in 5 of these convicts dying on this project. So the mortality rate is excruciatingly high. They were not given proper burials. They were not given proper graves. Most of them were just, there's a spot on the side of the tracks, bury them there, keep working, move on. They were not, yeah. So if you can imagine a 14-year-old's body being pitched on the side of the railroad and forgotten about, never marked. His family never told what happened to him, anything like that. We also have allegations of mass graves. It's likely that at the work campsites, we have Horseshoe Curve close to Tryon and the country club out there. The top of Melrose Falls, there was a work camp where they were extracting a lot of fill rock, so there's likely graves there. And it is also likely somewhere here in Saluda city limits, there is a mass grave as well. And that is on private property, so I'm not going to mention it. This system is regarded by some historians to be worse than slavery. And I don't say that lightly. Slavery is a truly cruel, cruel system. But we have to look at the economics behind the systems of slavery versus carceral labor and how that relates to brutality. In chattel slavery, an enslaver had most of their wealth actually in the people that they owned. So it was a very significant investment to own a human being. That was a costly investment. And so there was a financial incentive to not kill that person, because that person is your investment. That person is your capital. Unfortunately, with the convict leasing system, there is no financial incentive to keep these people alive. If they die, you just tell the state penitentiary they died. There's no repercussions. There's no fine they paid. There's no problem at all. They just send you another one to replace that person. And so they paid a same fixed rate for however many people were working that day. They paid $1 a day to the state, and they would have that person, the rights to that person's labor for that day. And so if this person died, that was fine. The railroad company didn't care. It was no financial burden on the railroad company to treat these people with humanity. And so if they killed someone to make an example out of that person for what happens when you say, no, I'm not going to work today, and you kill that person to make an example, it comes at no financial cost to the railroad company. And so instead, that's how they keep the threat of violence over these people as they continue to work. And so in this way, the death rate and the way that they were brutally treated is in some ways regarded as worse than slavery. Of course, in these times of brutality, we also see these people resisting, having moments of resilience, and self-emancipating. On November 30th, 1875, 13 convicts escape just outside of Tryon on the Pacolet River, and they just disappear into the forest, and only one of them is recaptured. Most of them are young, in their like 20s and 30s, but a 53-year-old is the only one who is recaptured. And in a total, along the Asheville and Spartanburg Railroad, 26 convicts are successfully able to escape, and then only 2 of them are ever recaptured. So that means 24 were never, ever recaptured. Particularly in this area compared to Buncombe County, it's very sparsely populated. So that means they're in their convict garb. They have the stripes. Everyone knows what their legal status is as a convict. But if you're in the middle of the woods, no one's here to rat on you. So a lot of them were able to escape here that were not able to in Buncombe County. We also see from a newspaper article in South Buncombe County, there were convicts that were in a bunkade, a stockhouse bunkade, and they refused to work. Some of them just stayed in and said, we're not coming out. Others came out, started picking up rocks and just throwing them at the overseers who were telling them it was time to work. And they were protesting for their freedom. They were saying, this isn't fair. I only stole an apple. Why am I doing 5 years hard labor? And they coordinated this. They had talked amongst themselves about this. And the overseers decided that the way to put down this mutiny, this riot, as they described it, was to pull out their rifles and shoot all the convicts in their legs as they were protesting until they surrendered, in which case those that were not injured were put back to work that day, and none of them were free. We can also infer, we don't have hard evidence of this, we can infer based off of few sentences that allude to certain things in newspaper articles, that there were some forms of underground networks of support. Of course, there's the Black community in Tryon that may have taken in some of those people who escaped and helped them get on their way. But there were certainly always communities, Black communities, that were willing to house people and willing to give people a fresh start. So there were probably underground networks of support that we'll never know about because they had to be kept very quiet, because these are now fugitives of the state. Despite committing negligible wrongs, they are now fugitives of the state. So afterwards, the train arrives in Saluda, it stops, financial issues. It gets up to Hendersonville, it stops, financial issues. It finally gets to Asheville Junction. All the newspapers are celebrating. The state legislature is very happy. Zebulon Vance has gone on to become a senator or House representative. He's in Congress. You know, all is well in Western North Carolina in regards to what you see on paper. But for the convicts, some of them have died working. They'll never return to their families, and most of their families were never informed of what happened to them. Others have not served their full sentence, and so they would go on to work on another state project for the railroad. They would be sent to the penitentiary to build the penitentiary, another state project, and that is where they might die. Some would actually live long enough to serve their full sentence, but they are left with a great deal of lifelong injuries, broken limbs, burns, cuts, and of course a great deal of trauma from this experience. And of course we have to think about those convicts who self-emancipated, who escaped, and where they may have gone. Many of them may have gone to South Carolina to get out of the jurisdiction of the state of North Carolina. Many of them may have settled in Western North Carolina, but maybe they had hopes of returning to Eastern North Carolina where they were from. And so convict leasing in this iteration, in this legal iteration, ends in the 1930s. No longer will the state lease these convicts out and their labor for private companies. But chain gangs continue well into the 1970s, and chain gangs are used on public road infrastructure projects. And to this day, we still have prison labor here in North Carolina. A lot of license plates and road paint are made by convicts in facilities that we can't see, but sometimes you will see people on the roadsides picking up litter in these kind of vests like this, and those are convicts, those are inmates. And it is important to note that to this day, Black men are still incarcerated at disproportionate rates with heavier sentencing compared to their white counterparts for the same crimes. And they still make up the majority of the prison population in North Carolina today. So this is still a deeply racialized system. So, very heavy. Everybody take a deep breath. When we're thinking about how we move forward as a community and all the things we have to consider as a community, recognizing this really terrible part of our history, but nonetheless a part of our history that made the community that we all love here possible. Saluda would not exist without the railroad. And so I turn to my Korean studies side. This is where I I'm going to draw some wisdom from the city of Gwangju in South Korea, where they also had a moment where thousands of people were massacred by the state for protesting for their democracy. And in this instance of state violence, they were ignored for many years. No one would acknowledge what had happened for many years, similar to what has happened with the convicts, where Nothing in 20th century scholarship acknowledges them. But I think this particular passage really resonated with me when I was in a museum, that May 18th, the day of the Gwangju massacre, is not an honor nor a burden, not a voucher nor a privilege. It is a debt, a sacrifice, and service. And so I think that really encapsulates how I think we should move forward with this. We should not feel burdened by this in a way where we feel guilty. This is not a moment for like white guilt. This is a debt that we need to repay as a community. This is a sacrifice. These are people that were sacrificed against their will for the name of progress. And so with those things in mind, I think we can move forward as a community. And so what does that actually entail? What does that actually look like? I think expanding our community knowledge will be important. Having talks like this where more people just know about it is important, but also really diving deeper into further research, getting more answers, really illustrating the stories of who are some of these people. And I'm going to be working on a book. You all need to force me to get that done. So keep reminding me, keep bugging me about it. I have my thesis, but that's a long way away from a book. Also, as we see the energy of the Rails to Trails, we really want to get those historical markers, and I can't just be the one person nagging about it. I need the community to be invested in seeing that as a part of what we imagine our version of the Rails to Trails to look like for our community. Also, it's important to support institutions like this. The Saluda Depot Museum, Historic Saluda Incorporated just down the street. It's really important that we keep these institutions and organizations going so that they can continue to tell the story of our community, so that young people will continue to know, so that when a college student wanders into a museum and has some questions, they can start their own research project. I think genealogical work will be really valuable to potentially reach out to some of the descendants, especially some of these younger convicts. They definitely were young enough to have served their sentence, continue to live, go on to have a family. So we can definitely infer that there's going to be people that are living today that are descended from these people and the sacrifices they made here in Saluda. And we have seen a lot of success in archaeological digs in other convict leasing sites in railroad communities in Western North Carolina. It's mostly about securing the funding for that, which is super hard. But I think it's really, really worthwhile for us to consider doing some archaeological work, especially at the work camps and mass grave sites. There's a lot of potential for us to learn a lot more about this story by doing those archaeological examinations. All right. Thank you so much for coming.